ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Scott Stedman podcast. Joining me is Micah Current. Micah, how are you doing today?
Man, I'm good. How are you?
It's been a day. I've started my in-person week at Ashland for my doctorate, had a missions trip meeting because I leave on a missions trip for a couple of weeks. And then I'm doing a podcast with you, which everything that seems to be going wrong is going wrong today. So,
Well, and I've had kind of a long day too, and normally we record these things on Monday mornings, and hopefully when your kiddos go back to school, we'll get on, kind of the fall schedule and get on kind of a normal rotation again where we can just get up on Monday mornings and record.
yeah, and actually, it'll be a little bit normal too, because both my son and daughter are going to the same school, so I don't have to take my son to school and then have a little bit of a recording time. And I'm like, okay, I got to go take my daughter to school now. It's like, they're at school, I'm back, let's do this. So
I think we did the first episode that we did with Trey Oldham, who was on our episode last week. The first time we recorded with him, you actually took your son to school, and then like you came back, we recorded, and then it was time to take your daughter to school, and so like you ran.
I was like, keep it
you
going.
just
I gotta
left
go
us.
take my daughter to
You
school. I'll be
left
right
us
back. Yeah, I remember that. That was funny.
And I just was telling you before we started recording it, I finished my second summer term class, and I finished that last week. I start my third one tomorrow, and my capstone project got approved, and I passed that class. And then I taught my leadership focus class this afternoon, and it's just been one thing after another. I worked at a church this morning and did some tech work for a church in town, and yeah. And here we are in the evening at eight in the evening instead of 8 in the morning when we typically.
Yeah, definitely. So since this has been an unusual recording time, let's just start off with stories gone wild. So Micah, last week my wife and I, or actually 2 weeks ago, my wife and I celebrated kind of an early anniversary trip, since we didn't know how the fall was going to look, since we were married in August with school starting and everything else. It just looked like we weren't going to get away. So we decided to do it early, and we decided to drive out to Indianapolis. And before we stayed at our hotel in Indianapolis, we actually drove up to Anderson to do a visit of Anderson University, which is where Laura and I met and kind of where we both went to our undergrad school with.
Is it still there?
Was that?
Is it still there?
It's still there. There was a couple surprising things. Like I think there was one time where they announced that they were going to demolish Rice Hall because and then like build like a new residence because it was kind of dated and everything else. And this was before the pandemic, and it was still up, and it was still people are still living in it. So I don't know if the pandemic had anything to do with that, but it still's up and still kicking.
Well, just for clarity's sake, Scott, you and Laura went to undergrad there.
Yes.
And I went to seminary there for graduate school. The first time I was in graduate school. Yep. So I was joking when I said, "Is it still there?" I couldn't tell you the last time I went to Anderson, or the last time I had been at Anderson. It's been a long time.
Yeah. So for the most part, it was good. We just got to go. We walked around, got to see some sights, which there's not much there at Anderson. Like besides the Eternal Flame and the John Morrison statue that's there. But one of the things that I walked, I know, like, who? One of the things that caught me completely off guard, because I completely forgot that Church of God moved their national offices. So they're not across from the university anymore.
Right. They're closer to Indy.
I forgot about that. So my surprise is I'm like, oh, I'm going to get my picture taken outside the national office, since, Scott Stedman podcast is always crapping on the national office about everything they do. It'll be a fun photo. And I walk over there, and the first thing I notice is I'm walking up by Reardon Auditorium. I'm walking up. First thing I see, this banner on the side that says, "Best deal in town, 5 foot by 5 foot space for $20. I'm thinking, oh, they must be renting offices. That's interesting. So I'm walking. I'm like, okay, I'll get to the door where it says Church of God, Church of God Anderson stuff. And I walk there, and I see like Storage USA right on the door. So I'm like, wait a minute, what? And Laura's like, well, maybe you're mistaken. Maybe it's farther down. I'm like, okay, so I'm walking farther down, and then I finally get to like the business school there. And I'm like, I start having a panic attack. Like, what happened to the national office? Like, and then I started making jokes to Laura. I'm like, man, we're really in a tough spot now. No wonder they had to raise the rate for pastors because they had to rent out their offices for storage space by the university. And then it was after I started making jokes, I realized, oh yeah, they moved over to like there's some offices over by Madison Park Church of God, and they're over there now. Like
I thought they were closer to Indy,
yeah,
Indianapolis. I thought that they were closer to Indianapolis.
maybe they moved again. I don't know. I thought there were some buildings over there by Madison Park or some. I thought, but I mean that was years ago. So
Sure.
I don't get the emails anymore. So or I never probably got the emails in the first place.
You need to sign
Except
up
for the
for
really
them.
important ones, like hey, we're going to have Facebook Live on a topic. Join us. Like, okay, that's the first email I've got from you in a while. So I was just making so much jokes about that. I'm like, man, how far have we fallen that now? How has the mighty has fallen? We're now Storage USA. We're not Church of God Anderson. We're Storage USA now. You can store all your spiritual baggage here.
So when you were an undergrad, was the new rec center done yet or no?
Yes, the Kardasky Center was just built right when I got there.
Okay. That was one of the newer venues or buildings on campus when I was there. But I don't know what years you were there. You're older than I am.
I left in 2000. I graduated in 2006. And then my wife was soon after that. And right when she was graduating, they just built Fair Commons.
Okay. So I was there in 2011. I started in January of 11.
Okay.
So yeah, for seminary. But I remember going to the rec center and it was still fairly in decent shape. And speaking of national convention, like newer by in decent shape, I mean newer. And then do you remember, we were talking about national convention last week, but do you remember the couple of years that Anderson actually hosted it and it was actually in the rec center? Do you remember that? Yeah. So that, and then Reardon is part of Anderson's campus. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. But it's right next to Park Place.
Yeah.
Okay. You can like walk to Park Place from where Reardon is. And for a couple of years prior to the national convention being in the rec center, this is like all after Warner was knocked down because of the asbestos, right? And
yeah, they started working on that like towards the tail end. There's jokes about the asbestos. There's skits there.
And so they were like, okay, what are we going to do with national convention? And then like they would have morning sessions over in Park Place, but they would have the main sessions over in Reardon. And then a couple of years they did it at Madison Park Church, which is down the road from Anderson, and then in Anderson, but down the road from the university. And then they did it, I think maybe 2 years in the rec center on Anderson's campus. And then there was a conflict with the Indianapolis Colts, summer camps or something.
Yeah.
And then it was at that point where, okay, we're going to just start moving this sucker out of Anderson and traveling all over the country. And you have to pay a fortune to go, but it's great. But was that the end of your story as far as just like you could have swore this is where the national offices was? I can just see you, Scott, walking around Anderson. Where is it?
Yeah, where is it? Like, and I'm like making jokes, like, my goodness, they're like selling office space here. Man, only less than 50% is giving to Anderson. They have to like sell off their offices. But then after a while, I said, well, that's smart because think about it. If a student has to like move out of their dorm and they know they're coming back next year, I could just get my stuff and just put it in a storage unit across the street, where there wasn't anything like that for me. So I really had to move all my stuff out and like move it back home. And it's like, well, I'm not going to use this stuff. So it just sat in the garage until I was ready to move back to Anderson again. So yeah, it's stuff like that where I'm like, oh, okay, cool.
So, completely off topic, but I work, I've shared several times that I work at a university. I work at Miami. We're a decent sized university, but I sit in different conversations with leadership on campus, and we're recently been having conversations about higher education and education as a whole, like moving forward. How is educational opportunities such as four-year universities going to be obtainable with the cost of tuition and living on campus and some of these bigger schools. But you mentioned Anderson, and I went to a smaller school for undergrad, maybe 3,000 students. Anderson, I would imagine 2,000 or less. Uh, how did these schools survive? Some of these smaller institutions, like where I went to school for undergrad, was West Liberty University, which was in West Virginia. 5 miles down the road was Bethany College. Scott, those schools are like West Liberty is 3,000 when I was there. 1,500 lived on campus, 1,500 commuted and lived, in other spaces closer to campus and would commute back and forth. Or even during the weekends, they would just flee the campus. And if you weren't local, like you just stayed there and you were one of the 10 people that stayed on campus during the weekends, which I ended up being one of those. And then Bethany College, man, they were like 1,000 people, if that. So I guess my question, is how are these smaller schools going to stay open moving forward with the cost of education going up and enrollment going down, and especially coming out of COVID? Like, how in the world are schools going to survive not being able to, make enrollment and afford things like turning the lights on, paying your faculty, paying your staff? We're already talking budget cuts next year for Miami and even the year after. That's not my story's gone wild, but you got me thinking about that when you said you went and visited Anderson.
Yeah, I mean, I know Ashland talked a little bit about how what they're doing at the seminary, because they had a situation where like one of the deans mismanaged money, and that kind of got them in a spot, and they're starting to kind of build back up from that. So one of the big things they do is I don't think like at the seminary they actually have like a full-time like professors there. Everything's adjunct. So you can have a professor that maybe, I mean, again, you think about seminary, you could probably have a professor who's serving at a church, and then they
It's
are,
on the side.
and then they're doing teaching on the side. Or you can have someone they may be teaching at Ashland University in the Bible and Religion department, and then they're teaching at seminary. Or you could have someone be teaching, in person at Ashland, and they're teaching online at Liberty University. So, there's a couple of options that they do have, or someone may be just retired and it's just like, I'm good. Or I know a lot of the professors, they have books and they write commentary, so they get money from the residuals of writing books or writing articles or doing stuff like that. So yeah, I'm not sure how some of them, like an Anderson, I mean, I know Anderson before made some changes to what programs they're going to offer. They got rid of an art thing, and it's now like the art building's like the engineering building. They got rid of the theater major, and they added dance, so there's a lot of stuff that they've changed, and they've done stuff to kind of make sure, like, well, what are some of the highest jobs that you can get? I don't think they'll ever cut the ministry job, but man, that'd be the day. Like Anderson University, yeah, we're not going to offer a ministry degree anymore.
Well, this year, the provost office asked just our division, for example, which is the College Creative Arts, in any situation, whether it's high school, K-12, whatever, college, four-year universities, graduate schools, the arts are always the first to get like the axe, right? Or they want you to cut budget with the arts because the arts don't, generate money because we're not sports and we're not, the face of the institution. So the provost's office came out and told us we needed to cut, I think, like $300,000 from our budget this year and $300,000 from our budget next year. And so as a staff, I think they were able to go through, and they've had a lot of long and tedious conversations, Scott, where it was like, all right, we're going to save everybody's jobs, but for the next couple of years, don't ask for nothing, period. So, and then like to what you said, like programs, like, if we're not, making enrollment for programs, we need to cut programs. Like it sucks and it's terrible to say, right? Like we need to cut programs. And it's hard when you got, tenured faculty that have, advanced degrees and they can't like basically get their job cut because they have tenure. But like you said, we have a lot of VAPs, is what we call them, visiting adjunct professors who teach, one or two classes super part-time. And there's a guy at our school that teaches music theory. but he also teaches for Northern Kentucky University, the University of Cincinnati. He works for the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and he works at Miami. So like he's full time, but he's like cut between 4 different places. So, yeah, all that to say, it's just it amazes me like how. Granted, I don't know what their endowments are like, or their donations, or what do they have in savings, or the money they have. Like when I was in seminary, they had the Lily McCutcheon scholarship fund for seminary students. So like if you kept a certain GPA and you were full time, they took a big chunk out of your tuition for a scholarship.
Yeah.
But that only goes so far, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, story's gone wild for me. We went down a huge rabbit hole, but you told me before we started recording, because you're so tired, that I was going to have to steer the ship a little bit. I was at church yesterday, and Scott, apparently we have quite the fan club at the Presbyterian church that my wife and I have been attending. I think maybe they're the reason you and I have hit this 10,000 downloads mark. I don't know. The pastor and his wife come up to me every week. They're like, "We listened to your episode this week. It was great. We really enjoyed it." So anyway, John is the music director at the church that we've been attending, and John is also a graduate from Miami. He did his undergrad and graduate degrees at Miami in music education. He's an outstanding piano player. And I'm walking out of church yesterday, and John stops me, and he's like, "Hey," I'm like, "What's going on?" He's like, I've been listening to your podcast, and I think that it's great." And I'm like, "Really? What do you like about it?" He's like, "The story's gone wild." And he was like, "Speaking of stories gone wild, I have one for you. And it has to do with this church. And you probably haven't hit it yet." And I was like, "Oh, really? What in the world have I missed?" We've talked about hand sanitizer. We've talked about sitting in different seats every week. We've talked about various things. And he was like, "Just go in the bathroom and tell me what you see." And I'm like, "What in the world is gonna, what am I gonna?"
Oh no.
So like I walk into the bathroom, and he's like, "Check out the urinal." So in the guy's bathroom, obviously there's a urinal and there's a toilet. So if I'm facing the urinal, Scott, to the bottom right hand side of the urinal is an outlet. So I was like, "You've got to be kidding me. How did I miss that?" But literally like 2 or 3 inches from the urinal is an outlet. If somebody misses, I'm thinking like a National Lampoon moment, or like a late 90s, early 2000s, like, I don't know, super cringy moment in like those raunchy movies that were popular in the early 2000s, where the worst thing possible would happen to somebody. So I thought about that, and I'm like, why would you put an outlet next to a urinal, or vice versa? Why would you put a urinal next to an outlet? And so, but all that to say, I think that it was funny that John stopped me yesterday. He was like, "I've really been enjoying your guys' podcast." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's awesome, man. Like, what do you enjoy about it?" He's like, "The story's gone wild." So apparently we just need to do stories gone wild every episode.
Well, there we go. Stories gone wild, everyone. That's all we do on the Scott Summit. Who cares about the serious stuff we talk about?
Well, and then you talk about the Church of God in there.
Oh,
where are their
I'm sure where yeah, let's beat up on the little guy.
Where are their offices?
It's not called Church of God Henderson. It's not Church of God National anymore. It's called Storage USA.
Instead of "Where's Waldo?" where's Chog Ministries offices?
Oh, yeah. I think I took a picture of that side banner. I'm gonna have to like send it to you, or maybe I'll put it on like in the comment section of this video. So the topic is actually kind of a spur of the moment thing. So I'm starting my class, and it's leading the church in the 21st century. And we're just talking about a variety of topics. So we're first talking about kind of like a leadership perspective from Paul, and we looked at First Timothy and kind of broke down the entire First Timothy epistle. And afterwards, the professor's like, "Okay, after breaking kind of all this down, like, what's something that you personally are taking away from this?" And one of the things, it's very early, where the Apostle Paul is basically talking about to show love to everyone. And the professor, kind of his interpretation was the idea of, well, love is not optional. Like if you're a Christian, love is not optional. So, and it made me, and I was just kind of saying, like, I think one of the big things about love is, there's very easy of just loving people in church, saying, like, oh, hi, how are you doing? Or praying for people. But I think sometimes love is also kind of rebuking people and kind of, I think love is very multifaceted within ministry. And I said, kind of what I'm taking away from this is that, even though I've been at this church for about a year, I do feel myself kind of being very guarded when it comes to loving people because of the
past experiences
that I had in ministry. And the professor just made a comment. He goes, sometimes being in a very bad place and having a bad ministry experience can really mess up people, because I've seen a lot of people, I've counseled a lot of people who literally were done with ministry. And it wasn't because of burnout. It wasn't because of anything. It mainly was because of just people not being kind or church people being nasty. And then he made the comment, he goes, someone needs to write a book, because I do believe that pastors do go get PTSD. And someone needs to write a book about that. And it just made me think about that topic of being in the ministry and having some type of PTSD. Because sometimes we connect PTSD to veterans who've served in war and how they get PTSD, but then we also see people like rape victims have PTSD. People have a lot of trauma, or sometimes even just in the workplaces. So we've seen that over the years, PTSD has kind of broken out of the military field, and it's kind of been in any type of like post-traumatic stress disorder that anybody has. And I'm sure ministry kind of falls into place. And it even made me think about, what were some of my behaviors now being in this ministry that when I first started out that I just no longer do anymore. And there's a pastor at a big church in Virginia when we'd have our pastor meetings. And one of the things he said, I've been in the ministry for over 40 years. And when I first started ministry, I was a very extroverted person. Always would go out, always want to do things, always hang out after church, always want to mingle and hang out with people. And he says, now I'm very introverted. If I'm in my office, I'm usually have the door shut and I'm studying, I'm doing it. Where before I'd have my door open. If anybody wanted to walk in my office and talk, I'd gladly. And now it's like I'm in my office. Once I'm done preaching, I'm usually may shake some hands, but right after that, I'm getting in my car and I'm going home. I'm not sticking around longer than that. Once everyone leaves the sanctuary, shakes my hand, I'm in my car and I'm driving away. And it was one of those things where I was just like, wow, like that could be a form of how ministry has really affected all the time of changing. So Micah, just kind of in your experience, not only in ministry, but even as a PK, where have you seen, or maybe stories you've heard where you could kind of say, yeah, I think maybe not as extreme as PTSD, but maybe definitely some of my behaviors or some behaviors of my friends in ministry, even behaviors you've seen in your dad from the early years as a kid to now, you've seen complete changes because of hurt in ministry.
Well, we went from being super, joking and cutting up to we went to super serious, kind of in the snap of a finger. But I believe it's a real thing. And I don't think that it would be, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, because I love you and I love Jordan a lot, very much like brothers. And, the three of us, we're going through a lot all around the same time. And I don't know that I've recovered. And I haven't shared like my full story on this show, probably because I'm very guarded, as you said.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid to share my story, but there's a lot of woundedness that goes along with it. And I would probably be lying if I said that if I was super hesitant, I wasn't super hesitant about joining a ministry position again or taking a ministry position again because of past hurt and because of past woundedness. And, I don't even know where to start, but like
Mhm.
um, with my dad, for example, I I think that generation is a lot different than ours. And I think we look at ministry through different, a lot different of a lens than what our dads did or the generation before us did, because that generation was very guarded and they just took it. And then um, I think it's pretty evident because you look at some of the pastors who are our father's ages, and they look very tired and they look very burnout and they look just exhausted, and they just, not to say they're not being valuable where they are, not to saying they're not still serving, not to say that they're not still making an impact where they are. It's that you can just tell that there's just this physical toll that ministry's taken on them for the past 30 or 40 years. Um, in respect to us, you know, people talk about mental health being a real thing, and I had an advising meeting with my advisor at Miami last week, and he actually, won't share his name or anything, but he talked to me about he went on medical leave in the spring, and part of it was he just had like a midlife crisis, and he didn't not believe what he was doing was making an impact. He didn't believe that he wasn't getting paid enough. It was just that he was doing too much and he needed to just stop. And he was just overwhelmed. He ended up in counseling and he ended up having to like just basically reinvent himself. And he got in shape. He lost a ton of weight. He started doing yoga. He, set up boundaries. And yeah, it's a real thing. And he and I, talked about mental health. And shortly after my mom passed away, I was in a transition in ministry myself, and I just hit a brick wall. And there was a lot of different things, right? So one, my mom passed away. I was uh, asked to fill in at a church in the community, and I started doing that. And um, there was a lot of trauma that went along with that, right? I don't feel like I got a chance to really grieve my mother's death, even though I grieved my mother's death. It was just kind of a weird situation.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, a couple of things that I started a ministry position, I started grad school, I was teaching leadership focus, and I was working full time. And I just realized that I was just saying yes to too many things. And during that season, um, my wife and I found out that we probably won't be able to have kids on our own.
Mhm.
So you throw that on top of everything that we've already been through. Um, we just, Scott, we smacked a brick wall, and we were like, I don't think we should be serving at a church right now. And it's not because I don't believe in Jesus and that he saved me and died for me. And it's not because I don't believe in my calling. And it's not because I don't believe that that piece of paper up there on the wall that you see is worth
Yeah.
anything. It's that I needed to stop and take care of myself. And we just agreed to sit down and step down and get help and go to counseling and go to therapy. And by the grace of God, I'm just so much better now that I've talked to somebody, and I know that you have, and I know that Jordan has, and we're all big advocates of pastoral care and therapy and counseling, whatever you want to call it. But you know, if I don't say anything else today, if you need to talk to somebody, talk to somebody. That's okay.
Yeah.
Um, it, the other thing is that I was teaching a leadership focus class today, um, and I told folks like that we studied the passage in Exodus when Jethro is talking to Moses, and he's like, Moses, this isn't good. You can't do it all by yourself.
Yeah.
And I know that's kind of the case and the norm for smaller churches where, maybe you're a church of 50 people and you're the pastor, you're making your slides, you're running your live stream, you're making sure the sound works, you're making hospital visits, you're doing counseling sessions, you're doing the weddings and the funerals, you're dedicating the babies, you're doing literally everything. And it's still not enough.
Mhm.
Um, but, you know, I'm slowly getting to the place where I'm wanting to serve again, but I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
And I've stated openly, I think on this show and in other spaces, that I don't know if I ever want to take a paycheck from a church again.
Hmm.
And that's not because I need the money or don't need the money. It's just I feel like there's a sense of ownership over leadership when you start taking pay, and I just don't feel good about that.
Hmm.
Um, and I'd rather do it as a volunteer and know that I'm being valued for my service to the kingdom without the strings attached to being paid for it. So I know I said a lot there. I didn't know where we were going with this conversation, but
No, it's okay. No, it's interesting too, because I mean, I went away because you said you talked to someone. I went away to a program
oh yeah,
to
you
talk
did
to
that. I forgot
someone.
about that.
And actually, the person who kind of started it through Healing Care Ministries International, Dr. Terry Wardle, I mean, he wrote a book about kind of his life. And I mean, he tells a lot about how he was pastoring a huge mega church down in California. And he was a professor at like Colorado University. And he ended up having a panic attack. And, church gave him time off, and he took a couple months to recover, and he thought it was good. He started to go back, started to get into things, had another panic attack, and checked himself into a mental hospital. And for him,
Mm.
I don't know all the details. I know he wrote a book about it, and I haven't read it yet, but I know a lot of it had to do with just, ministry stuff, but a lot of it had to do with this idea of proving himself to think he was good enough. And, especially from the environment and growing up in the household that he did. So there was a lot of stuff that kind of came with that. But then, like, even at lunch today, there's a guy who, when I first started the program, like, I came into the program not even having a ministry job. And I just started to do my doctorate just to kind of, eventually I hope that once I get my doctorate, I go into the consulting business, or I write books, or do a podcast or do something to really.
Already did that.
Yeah, I already did that. But to really help people, or to really help people with leadership, both lay and pastors, because it seems like that's always a need. And this was a guy who was a pastor of a church. He's also like an army chaplain. And he was very enthusiastic about everything. We take a class, he's very enthusiastic. He's like, oh, I'm going to try to implement this in my church. It's going to be great. To now, he's resigned from his church. He's right now just kind of doing more interim stuff. And then he was even talking about, at this point, I don't even know if I'd ever go back to doing preaching ministry again, or being a pastor of a church. Like he said, because really, if I do go back to a church, I got to make sure that it's a healthy environment, and that they have a specific like discipleship program. If they already have that established, and I'm just kind of going in and I can kind of help tweak it a little bit and then really do some great stuff, then I'm in. And it's like, cool. But I also know the reality that, trying to find a healthy church is kind of hard, very few churches out there that you could say is healthy nowadays, especially after the pandemic. So, and I think that's kind of a big thing. Like, here's someone who's definitely has had some church hurt, and he's to the point where he's like, I'm content with not going back and being a pastor anymore. I remember when I took this position here in Bexley, like, the funny thing is people thought, whoa, is it a downgrade from going from being a lead to being a family minister? I'm like, absolutely not. It's definitely not a ground. I mean, do I miss preaching every Sunday morning? Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, because I really don't want to have to keep trying to figure out sermons that I have to preach every week. Like, and they use a liturgy, so that's helpful. I could just say, oh, this is the verse I'm preaching on. Okay, cool. So he does that work for me. But even things like,
Well, it's not uncommon either.
it is, yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
you see a lot of times, like lead pastors go to be like an associate, or like if maybe they're older towards the end of their career, they go serve as like an executive pastor or a senior adult pastor, and they're not like in a preaching rotation every week. That's totally not uncommon.
No, it's not common at all. I think it's just more of kind of the Western view of, like, you're working your way up the ladder, and now you're at the top, and now you're going back down a rung. Like, oh, that's it's almost like, oh, that's shameful. It's like, no, it's not. But even like things like board meetings, like, I've probably been to maybe 5 board meetings here at the church I'm working at. And literally, I don't say a single word. I sit there, I listen, I just kind of assess everything that's going on. I don't speak in the meeting. I don't even offer an opinion. Like in staff meeting, I will. I'll ask questions. But when it's a general meeting, like I used to love going to meetings and just thinking about, oh, what are some things that what's God doing? Here's a good report about here's this going on. Great, 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 great. Like all this great stuff. And now it's just like, I'm here, but I don't want to, but I don't really want to be here. I mean, in some cases I do, because it's always, I mean, the Methodist Church here, they have a bunch of different things. So sometimes it's good to hear the reports on the different sides of the church. So I kind of know, like, oh, here's what's happening with this ministry. Here's what's happening in the worship side of things. Here's what's happening in the financial side of things. Here's kind of what's happening and then I give my report with youth and children. So, but even at that meeting, and that was the other thing too, that I realized another issue that I figured out is we're in that meeting and they're talking about stuff and we're right now going to hire a consultant to come in and kind of help see some blind spots within the church to kind of help us address it so we can kind of re-gear and revitalize the church, because we're kind of like in a rebuilding mode after the pandemic and everything. And there's an older gentleman who is, he understands about the Methodist Church. He goes, I read a report that something about how a lot of pastors are leaving the ministry, and I just want to make sure that Colleen doesn't get plucked up and gets taken away, and I also don't want Scott to get plucked up and taken away. And I said, I'm not Methodist, so they are not going to pluck me and take me away. And everyone started laughing, but then instantly everybody in the room was just basically saying, I don't think the congregation really knows how lucky we are that we have Scott and Colleen here.
Mm-hmm.
And even Colleen just kind of said, I think people don't really realize how lucky, we have Scott here. Because I mean, I was at a point where literally if I couldn't find anything, I was content of just saying, I'll find something else to do and not do ministry anymore. I mean, I was at that point where I just, after I got my healing retreat and everything else, I'm like, if I don't do ministry again, it's okay. I don't have to do it. But even that, and people just giving me praise and compliment and saying, oh, Scott, you're doing such a good job with this. You're so good. You're doing this. And we're just so lucky and so happy. And it's like, I just can't take that compliment, because I feel like even if I take the compliment, the question that's mine, okay, what's underneath that? Where's the backhand coming from?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's been many times in ministry where I've had people say, oh, you're doing such great work. We definitely see the Holy Spirit moving in you and doing great things. And then like the next day or even the next week, the same person could say something very mean-spirited and just cut me down. And it's just like, what? Like it was just like every time there's this times where I felt like time stood still, and I just was like, don't know what to do or how to process things. And even now, like sometimes if someone says, oh, you're doing a good job or something, I always say, well, yeah, but then, and I start getting in the negative, or I start making excuses about something. It's like, just accept the compliment, man. But I can't take the compliment. I just can't do it anymore. And I don't know. And it's hard, because it was never like that. Usually someone gave me a compliment, I was very humble. I'm like, oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm very humbled by your words.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't say that anymore. I just don't do that anymore. If people compliment me, I don't believe it anymore.
Something that I've noticed recently. So a couple things. Like one, I feel like I'm going to be all over the place with this, but like, so when I lost my job when COVID hit in 2020, I got laid off from the university. I was working super part-time at the church that I was at. And I had seen how the senior pastor reacted to other staff members leaving. And so I was petrified to tell him that I had another church that was talking to me about a full-time opportunity that was going to be, a full-time job, because I was jobless. Essentially, I was working for a stipend for this church. And it was basically the same thing that I was doing for the church, but on a much larger scale. It was a bigger church. It was a multi-site campus. And um, I went to a friend of mine in the church who happened to be an elder and said, "This is just off the record, but will you pray for me about an opportunity of a job opportunity?" I didn't say what it was. I just said it was a job opportunity. Would you pray for me? Um, Pastor found out and blew a gasket and screamed at me. He called me and I put it on speakerphone, and my wife was working at home because this was early in the COVID phase in 2020. It was like, April or May or something of that year. And he caught wind of it, and I put him on speakerphone and just put it on my wife's desk. And we just sat there and cried because he just screamed at us, because how dare, after everything I've done for you, how dare you not tell me? How dare you go to the elders and not tell me? And he called an elder meeting and said, "It's come to my attention that Micah's been offered a job, and some of you knew about it, and I want to know what we're going to do about this moving forward." Um, I did not have a job offer at that point, and then the Sunday morning he came up to me after yelling at me, after calling a board meeting, and the words out of his mouth, and I'll never forget it. He said, "So did you get the job?" I'm like, "Are you kidding? You just called and yelled at me and my wife. You called and yelled at the two elders that I had a conversation with about this. You yelled at the elders and said that I had a job when I didn't. And then the first thing out of your mouth is, did you get the job?" And so I went in that morning after services were over and I resigned. And I said, "I can't do this anymore." And his son, who I served with on the worship team, and he was on staff too, was going to be on vacation those next 2 weeks. And he was like, "So does this mean you're giving me 2 weeks, a month? Are you done today? What does that mean?" And he's like, "Well, my son's going on vacation. I need somebody to cover for him." He didn't care that I was resigning. He just wanted to make sure that things were covered. And so I said, "I'll give you 2 weeks," because I've always given people 2 weeks, where no matter the job and no matter where I've been, and I want to live by that and honor that. Um, that was one. And then, like, I find it interesting too that, the church that I went to next, which is a bigger church, full-time position, 7 months into it, I just realized that that's not where God wanted me. And he wanted me to go and do things like consulting and helping churches and podcasting and doing leadership things and teaching for Leadership Focus, and other ministry opportunities that I could just do freelance versus being in the same place every single week. And how I knew that, and we've talked about the Holy Spirit, and we've talked about other things on this and different topics, but like, I got the call to lead at our satellite location, and I got asked to go lead worship at this church, our satellite church, for the church I was working at, because the worship leaders, who's a really good friend of mine, his wife got COVID, and they had two little girls. They have two little girls, but they were really young at the time, and I was like, "Mark, there's no way that you're going to be able to come and lead worship, especially with your wife with, having COVID." And that was early on in the COVID season where none of us knew what was going to happen. I said, "Hey, I'll come lead worship for you." Long story short, I was leading worship and kind of had this spontaneous moment, and uh, just felt like the Holy Spirit was saying, "You're done. You're done here." And I want you to go and lead worship, and I want you to go and serve the church that I called you to serve. And um, confirmation for me was, I had not talked to Alicia, my wife, at all about it. And I got off the platform after I had this wonderful moment of worship and prayer. And I got down, and my wife's like, "You're going to resign, aren't you?" And I went into my boss's office the next day and said, "Hey, I just don't feel like this is where I'm supposed to be." And she's like, "We agree." And so we parted ways. Um, Fast forward to the last year of my life, when I decided to get help and go to therapy and step back from full-time ministry and serving every single week. Um, Alicia and I kind of agreed to 3 months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year. We weren't going to serve in the local church, and maybe just go to church, go find a church, go visit churches, but not serve. And just go to church for the first time in our married life, not as pastors, but as people that need community and need the church just as much as pastors do, or just as much as your lay people do. And we, uh, I had some commitments prior to stepping down. I led worship at a community Thanksgiving service last fall, and that was one time. And then I played drums on Easter this year, and that's been the only times that I've led worship or played in a worship service in the last what has it been, like 8-9 months. And I say all that to say that, you talk about post-traumatic stress syndrome and kind of feeling weird and kind of off. And you talked about the guy that he stepped back from ministry and he wanted to be a healthy situation. I've been asked to fill in. I've been asked to lead worship. I've been asked to participate in nights of worship. But there has been moments where, Scott, I'm not kidding you, I'm getting ready to go do this. And I don't have panic attacks, but I just have this doubt where, not that I can't do this, because I can pick up this guitar right now and play and lead you in a set of worship right now, or this keyboard or whatever. It's just I get in my own head and I just feel like I'm not ready. I'm just not ready yet. It's not that I can't do it. It's just I just don't feel like I'm ready because there's some scars there. There's wounds, and it's like, what if I go back in and something bad happens again? What if I go back in and somebody doesn't like the worship I lead? What if they don't like the prayer I said? What if they don't like the clothes I'm wearing? What if they don't like that my head's shaved? I get in my own head, and I think that's a very real thing. And it's very debilitating. I was supposed to lead worship at a night of worship or participate in a night of worship a couple months back. And it was on a Saturday, and Alicia and I went around running around doing stuff on Saturday morning, and we got home and it was like 2 hours before I was supposed to be there. And I was like, Alicia, I can't do it. I can't go. I had all the charts on my iPad. I had my guitar packed, ready to go. I just could not do it. And I texted the guy. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I'm just not in a place where I can lead right now. And he's like, I totally understand. And I started crying, like in the middle. I was sitting in the floor in our bedroom and I was just crying like a baby because I felt like I don't want to let people down, but I don't want to let myself down. And I don't want to, and then my therapist said, maybe God's preparing you for something better down the road. And it's okay to not be ready now. And then one of my good friends, Jessica Schaefer, she is a teacher at Miami. She teaches voice. And she said one of the most profound things to me when I was talking to her, kind of just as a non-ministry person, as a third-party friend, as somebody who, she's like, you're always welcome at our church. But one of the things she said to me, she was like, sometimes it's okay to sit still and sit in God's presence. And for the last 10 years, Scott, so much of my identity was wrapped up in, I got to be the worship pastor. I got to be the worship leader. I went to seminary for this. I went to school for music. I got ordained in the Church of God. I did all these things, and I have to remember my identities in Christ, and it's not in the church, the local church. It's not in being the creative arts pastor or the production pastor. Do I know how to do all those things? Yes. Has God blessed me with talent immensely? Yes. Am I thankful for all those things? Yes. But sometimes it's okay to sit still and sit in God's presence. And I think you went through that too, right? When you stepped down from the position you were in Virginia. And did you ever think that you were going to be in a bakery baking bread at 2 a.m.? Did you?
No.
You went to wherever Tyler Wines is at, the church in Virginia.
Bridge Christian Church.
Yeah, Bridge Christian Church. Like, did you ever think that you were just going to be sitting at a church in your 30s? Like, what the heck am I doing here? I went to school for this and I got ordained, but I think, I don't know, to kind of sum it all up, that mental health is a real thing and it's important to take time off and know your limits and know that it's okay to pour into other folks. And I think when I realized that too, like it's okay to sit still and sit in God's presence, and do things besides lead worship every single Sunday. Like, I love doing this podcast stuff with you and Jordan. It's very much an outlet, but it's also like we talk some pretty deep and heavy things, but we also talk on some pretty inspirational things like leadership and how to lead people. And we talk about worship, and we talk about the crazy stuff that we see in the church and that we see other churches doing, Hillsong. Hillsong. Like but it sucks that you went through that stuff, and it sucks that I went through that stuff. It sucks that Jordan and others have went through those things, but it's also okay to share those things. I've listened to several podcasts. There's one it's I listened to the Marcel for sure, but there was another podcast that a friend of mine recommended, and it's about the hosts. It's a guy and a girl. They're both pastors, or they were pastors, and they stepped down, and they talked about their experiences, and kind of the freedom that goes along with not serving every week. Like, I woke up yesterday, we were running a little bit late for church, and I'm like, hey, we're going to be late. And she's like, well, do you want to go? I'm like, we don't have to. Do you know how liberating that is? Right? Yeah. It's just, I'm not making excuses, but like there's something to be said. And I know people talk about going on sabbaticals and stuff like that, but like, if you get the opportunity, one of my leadership focus guys right now, he's a pastor out in Vancouver, Washington. And he got granted a 3-month sabbatical. And so I jumped on a Zoom call with him last week, and he said for the first like 2 or 3 weeks, he just didn't know what to do with himself. This church is like a church of 800 to 1,000, and he's like the pastor of creative and an executive pastor role. And he just was like, I just didn't know what to do with myself.
Yeah.
Because you just get so like in the zone and in the nitty gritty of the church, and that's not healthy either. So
yeah,
I don't know, Scott. I've been all over the place.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on any of those things?
I think going back to my professor, like, someone needs to write a book about this, because there definitely is PTSD in ministry. I mean, I think just you and I sharing our stories, and then just kind of knowing the stories of others, and just the briefly experiences of just people, even conversations I heard around lunch today, like. It's a real thing. And I think if you're someone who, maybe you're a pastor, maybe you're kind of at that place where you go, I've served for X amount of years, and the things that I used to do, I don't do anymore, or the things that, there may be certain things where I do have like a sense of anxiety, or do have a thing where I'm just, always double checking myself or triple checking myself, or just feel like that I'm not in a good place, or I don't feel settled about walking into a meeting, or settled walking in to teach a bunch of kids about Jesus. Like, something's going on there. And I think that's important for us to recognize those moments, to talk about them with a trusted therapist, or even a good pastoral friend who kind of understands, and is not just going to say, well, just trust God more, because that doesn't really help. And I think that's just kind of something there. So maybe for you, those of you who are listening, maybe you're somebody who you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh yeah, definitely. Like, and if you would like to share that story, you can email us at the at my website, thescottstedman.com. You can just hit to email me, and we'll get your emails. Feel free to leave comments, share this with any of your friends, family, neighbors, or just share it with a Presbyterian, because apparently they're our biggest fans right now. So all your Presbyterians out there, thank you. But friends, that's going to be it for us. It is late, and I know I have to get to bed and then get up early and drive to Ashland tomorrow. So friends, thank you for listening to the Scott Stedman podcast. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and we'll be back on with another episode soon. Take care.